When you picture surviving a brutal winter on the frontier, you think about heat, more firewood, a bigger stove, thicker walls. You imagine the fight as a war against cold, and you measure victory in degrees. But the cold was not what killed most people's animals. What killed them was 40 yards. The distance between a cabin and a barn, a distance a person could walk in a minute on a clear day and could not cross at all when the wind erased the world. One woman on the Wyoming plains understood this before the first snow fell, and what she built between her kitchen and her barn changed who lived and who did not. Torgrim Brekka was already in the ground when Marit cut the frozen rope from his wagon tongue with a skinning knife and counted what remained. 2 sacks of flour, 1 barrel of oats, a cook stove with a cracked firebox plate, and $43 folded inside a tin cup. 8 draft horses stood in a corral made of cottonwood poles lashed with rawhide. 3 milk cows and 4 calves pressed together in a lean-to that leaked from every seam. This was the Brekka claim. 160 acres of Wyoming territory, grass along the lower Powder River, bought with a dead man's name and held by a woman no one expected to last until November. Torgrim had been crushed beneath a loaded freight wagon near Fort Fetterman 6 weeks before. A rear axle split on a washboard grade, and the load shifted. 2 men pulled him free, but his chest was broken in 4 places. He died that night on a plank floor in a way station, and the freighter who brought Marit the news also brought a bill for the burial timber. She owed $76.50 at Pike's General Store. Feed, nails, lamp oil, a length of stovepipe, salt, and flour bought on credit against a future that no longer existed. The note was written in Rufus Pike's careful hand, every item listed, every price exact. At the bottom, Pike had drawn a line and written, "Payable in full or in kind before first snow." The claim was legal. Under the Homestead Act, a widow could hold 160 acres in her own name. The law did not care that she had no sons, no brothers within 1,000 miles, and no neighbor willing to bet labor on her survival. The law said she could stay. The land said nothing at all. She could not leave. There was no family east to return to. Her parents were dead in Minnesota. She had no money for rail passage and no destination that would accept a 26-year-old Norwegian widow with 8 horses she could not afford to feed and a debt she could not afford to pay. The claim was the only thing standing between Marit Brekka and destitution, and the claim required her body on the ground for 5 years. The first man to visit was Captain Abram Tolliver. He came on a Tuesday in late August, riding a bay gelding with a cavalry brand still visible on the left hip. Tolliver was 58 years old, a former Union quartermaster who had turned his supply chain mind toward cattle after the war. He ran stock on open range north of the Powder River Fork and employed 6 men year-round. In the valley, his word carried the weight of a banker's signature. When Tolliver said a thing would fail, men adjusted their plans accordingly. He dismounted without being invited. He walked the corral fence, pressed a gloved hand against the lean-to boards, looked inside the half-finished cabin where Marit had hung a canvas sheet to block the wind through the unfinished west wall, and returned to where she stood holding a water bucket. "You have 1 stack of hay," Tolliver said. He pointed at the low mound near the barn. "That is maybe a cord and a half. You need 6 minimum for 8 horses through a Wyoming winter, more if the winter's bad. You have a barn with cracks I can see daylight through from 20 feet. You have a cabin with 1 finished wall, and you have 1 pair of hands." Marit set the bucket down. "I have 2 pairs," she said. She held them up, palms forward. The skin across her knuckles was already cracked from hauling water in the dry wind. Tolliver did not smile. "Those are not enough, not for what is coming." He told her the accepted strategy. Move the horses to a larger ranch that could absorb them for winter, sell half the stock now, before prices dropped in September, or hire 2 men at 40 cents a day plus board to help her cut hay and finish the cabin before the ground froze. Every option collapsed under its own weight. Pike would offer pennies on the dollar for draft horses he expected to own by default. No rancher north of the Powder River wanted to feed another widow's animals when their own herds were already too large for the grass, and hired men at 40 cents a day would cost more than she had in 3 weeks, not counting the food she did not have to feed them. "Sell the horses," Tolliver said. "Keep the cows. Work the claim with what remains. A woman alone can hold 160 acres with dairy stock and garden ground. You cannot hold it with 8 animals that eat like hired men and do no work in winter. He mounted and turned the bay toward the gate. Then he stopped. Your husband was not a fool, Tolliver said, but he bought horses for freight work, and freight work requires a man. You have the horses. You do not have the man. He rode north without looking back. Marit stood in the yard for a long time after he left. The wind pushed the canvas sheet inside the cabin so it billowed like a lung. One of the horses stamped and blew. The light was already changing, the August gold thinning toward the iron gray that meant autumn was not distant. It was here. She went inside and counted the flour. 2 sacks, perhaps 80 pounds total. The oats were for the horses, not for her. The cook stove worked, but the cracked plate meant she could not build a fire hot enough to bake bread properly. She had salt, a half tin of lard, dried beans enough for perhaps 6 weeks, and 11 cans of tomatoes that Torgrim had bought in Sheridan as a surprise. The surprise now was how little distance 11 cans traveled when measured against a Wyoming winter. That night she heard a sound outside the cabin and found a calf dead against the corral fence. It had slipped through a gap between the poles, wandered into the open grass, and laid down in the first hard frost of the season. Its body was still warm when she touched it, but the legs were stiff. 4 calves had become 3. The math had worsened while she slept. She dragged the calf away from the fence by its hind legs because she did not want the cows to stand over it. The hide was worth something if she could cure it, but she did not have the salt to spare. She left the body in the grass beyond the corral and went back inside and sat on the floor near the stove and pressed her palms against her knees until they stopped shaking. 8 horses, 3 cows, 3 calves, $43, $76.50 owed, 1 cord and a half of hay, 1 pair of hands. The numbers did not change no matter how she counted them. October came fast and cold. The grass along the Powder River turned the color of old rope. The cottonwoods dropped their leaves in a single week of hard wind, and the bare branches clattered against each other like bones in a sack. Marit had spent September cutting hay with a scythe she sharpened every evening until the stone wore a groove in the blade. She managed to add 2 more cords to the stack, bringing the total to 3.5. She needed 6 at minimum. The gap was visible from the cabin door, a stack that should have been twice as tall, sitting in the brown grass like an accusation. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as failure. On the 4th of October, a squall blew in from the northwest without warning. Not a true blizzard, that was still months away, but a driving mix of sleet and grit that turned the air white and dropped visibility to the length of an outstretched arm. Marit needed to feed the horses. The barn was 40 yards from the cabin door. 40 yards. She could throw a rock that distance on a calm day. She lit a lantern, wrapped a scarf over her mouth, lifted a bucket of mash in her free hand, and stepped outside. The wind took the lantern flame before she had gone 10 steps, not extinguished it, bent it sideways until the glass cracked and the wick guttered. She kept walking, counting paces, but the sleet came from her left, and then from her right, and then seemed to come from above. She lost the wagon rut she had been following with her boots. She dropped the bucket. She could not find it again. She went to her knees and crawled, one hand forward, feeling frozen ground, until her fingers struck the barn wall. Inside the barn, the horses were stamping and blowing. They had not been fed since morning. Marit leaned against the wall and breathed through the scarf and realized a thing she had known since childhood, but never understood in her body until that moment. Distance on the prairie in a storm is not measured in yards. It is measured in visibility. 40 yards of open ground might as well have been 40 miles when the air filled with ice and the earth disappeared. She fed the horses with what was already in the barn, a quarter measure, not enough, and waited 2 hours for the squall to thin before she crawled back to the cabin. The bucket she had dropped was 15 feet from the barn door. She had walked past it. That night she lay on the cabin floor near the west wall. The stove had burned down to coals because she had not added wood while she was in the barn. The floor was cold everywhere except one place. a strip near the base of the wall, where the boards met the packed earth. The cats slept there. They had always slept there. Marit pressed her hand against the boards and felt warmth. Not heat. Warmth. The difference between frozen and merely cold. The memory came without effort. Her father, Halvor, kneeling in the root cellar of the Minnesota farm. She was 7 years old, standing behind him in the dark, watching him press his hand against the stone wall and then against the plank wall behind the cow stall. The cellar was dug into a hillside, and the back wall touched earth that never froze. "Feel," he had said, and placed her hand on the cold stone. Then he moved it to the plank. The plank was warm, not from any fire, from the cow behind it, and from the ground itself, which held whatever warmth people were foolish enough to let escape. "The earth does not make heat," Halvor said. "It keeps what foolish people let escape." Marit lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling, the cabin, the barn. 40 yards of killing ground between them, 40 yards that became infinite in a storm. But underground, there was no wind. Underground, the temperature held steady. Underground, the earth was a wall thicker than any she could build. What if the barn and the cabin were not two buildings? What if they were one building, connected beneath the surface? She sat up in the dark and felt along the floor until she found a charcoal stick. She smoothed a flour sack across her knee and began to draw. A trap door in the cabin floor near the stove. A sloped passage descending 5 feet below grade. A covered trench running 40 yards to the barn, shored where the soil was weak, roofed with poles and sod and earth. A second hatch inside the barn, a draft shutter to control airflow. The design was not genius. It was a root cellar stretched long and given doors at both ends. But the implications grew as she drew. The passage would be sheltered from wind. The earth walls would hold stable temperature. The horses breathing in the barn would generate warmth, close to 100 degrees of living heat from each animal. And that warmth would move through the connected air slowly, gently, into the passage and toward the cabin floor. She could feed twice a day in any weather. She could water without crossing open ground. She could check on a sick animal at midnight without risking death by disorientation. But the design carried risks that Marit could name, but not yet solve. Collapse, seepage, bad air, snowmelt flooding the passage in spring, rats nesting in the walls, rot in the roof timbers. A passage that became a grave if the soil was wrong or the shoring failed. She needed someone who understood earth the way her father had. Someone who had built into the ground and lived to judge whether it held. Berit Vangen lived 4 miles south of Marit's claim, in a sod house she had occupied for 9 years. She was 61 years old, a widowed Norwegian midwife who had helped build a turf-roofed cow house in Wisconsin before coming west. She knew drainage the way other women knew bread making, by feel, by smell, by the color of the soil on a shovel blade. She could read frost depth in October by pressing a knitting needle into the ground and timing how far it sank. She had buried a husband and 2 children on the prairie and stayed because the prairie was the only thing that had not yet left her. Marit did not ride to Beret's house with a plan. She rode with a question: how deep does the frost go here, and does the clay drain or hold? Beret led her inside without greeting. She looked at the flour sack drawing Marit laid on the table and said nothing for a long time. Then she pushed a knitting needle into a pan of damp soil she kept near the stove for starting seeds. She poured water over the soil and watched it drain. "Dig wrong," Beret said, "and you build a grave with doors." Marit waited. Beret turned the pan and poured again. This time the water sat on the surface, pooling in the shallow depression the needle had left. That is what happens when you cut through clay and find no gravel beneath it. The water has nowhere to go. It freezes. It expands. It pushes your walls apart from below. She set the pan down. "Tell me what you know about the soil on your claim." Marit described it layer by layer, topsoil thin and sandy near the surface, then a band of brown clay starting at 2 feet, then a mix of gravel and harder clay below 3.5 feet. She had seen this when Torgrim dug the post holes for the corral. Beret listened with her arms crossed. When Marit finished, Beret asked a question that changed the design. Which way does water want to move on your land? Marit did not know. She had not thought about it. Water fell. Water soaked in. Water froze. She said as much. Water is not stupid, Beret said. It follows the ground. If your ground tilts even 1 inch in 40 yards, the water will find it. Dig a passage and ignore the tilt, and you have built a cistern, not a corridor. Over the next hour, Beret taught 3 principles that would hold the tunnel together, or bury Marit beneath it. First, crown the roof. A flat roof collects meltwater on top and lets it seep through gaps between poles. A slight crown, even a few inches higher at the center than the edges, sheds water sideways into the earth instead of straight down into the passage. Second, slope the floor. 1 inch of drop for every 8 feet of length. Not enough to feel while walking, but enough to keep water moving toward a gravel sump at the low end. Beret said the sump should be near the barn because the barn end would be lower on Marit's land. Third, keep the passage small. A tall, wide tunnel needs heavy timbers and wide-span roofing that fights the weight of wet soil. A passage just tall enough to walk hunched, 5 feet from floor to roof peak, and just wide enough to carry a bucket in each hand, 3 feet at the bottom, 4 at the shoulder, could be roofed with cottonwood poles that Marit could cut and place alone. Do not build a room, Beret said. Build a throat. Air moves through a throat. Heat moves through a throat. A room just sits there and waits to fall. Marit asked the question that kept her awake. Can I finish it before the ground freezes? Beret looked at the drawing again. 40 yards, 5 feet deep, that is... She paused, calculating. 600 cubic feet of earth minimum, not counting the width. You are 1 woman with a shovel. 2 shovels, Marit said. Beret almost smiled. You are 1 woman with 2 shovels, and perhaps 10 weeks before the clay becomes stone. If you dig and shore and roof at the same time, cutting corners, working past dark, neglecting the hay you still need... She stopped herself. You will have to choose. Dig the passage or cut the hay. You do not have time for both. The gamble was plain. If Marit spent autumn digging, she would not cut the 3 additional cords of hay she needed to carry 8 horses through winter. If she cut hay instead, she would have feed but no way to deliver it when the weather made the barn unreachable. The tunnel was a bet against the calendar. Finish in time and the hay shortage becomes survivable because she can ration and deliver in any storm. Fail to finish, and she has neither passage nor feed. Both paths held ruin. One held a chance. Marit folded the flour sack and stood. Will you come look at the soil yourself? Beret said nothing for several seconds. Then she reached behind the stove and pulled out a pair of heavy leather gloves with the fingers worn through at the tips. I will come look, she said, but I am not promising to dig. Niels Mohn saw the chalk marks first. He was riding past Marit's claim 2 days later on his way to the freight road, and he pulled his horse up short when he saw the white lines drawn in the dirt between the cabin and the barn. Stakes driven every 6 feet. Twine pulled taut between them, 40 yards end to end, straight as a plumb line. At each stake, a small chalk X marked the edge of the cut. Niels was 34, a neighboring homesteader who ran a few cattle and hauled freight part-time to cover his store account. He was not unkind. He had helped Torgrim set fence posts the previous spring and had brought Marit a sack of potatoes after the funeral without being asked. But kindness on the frontier was rationed like everything else, and Niels had his own winter to worry about. He dismounted and walked the line, counting stakes. You are digging, he said when Marit came out of the cabin. I am digging. From the cabin to the barn. Yes. Niels looked at the chalk marks, and then at the sky, and then at the ground, as if consulting all 3 for an opinion. You are digging the road twice, he said. Once down and once back up, in October, with no help, while your haystack sits at 3.5 cords. Marit picked up the shovel leaning against the cabin wall. I can count the hay from here, Niels. I counted it yesterday, and I will count it tomorrow. The number does not change by looking at it. And it does not change by digging a ditch either. This is not a ditch. What is it then? Marit did not answer. She drove the shovel into the first chalk mark and turned a square of sod the size of a dinner plate. The grass roots tore with a sound like ripping cloth. Niels watched her cut 3 more squares before he mounted and rode on. He did not offer to help. He did not say she was wrong. He said something worse because it was true. The ground freezes in 6 weeks, 8 if you are lucky. Marit kept cutting sod. The first 6 feet of surface came away in slabs that she stacked along the trench line for later use. Beneath the sod, the topsoil was sandy and loose, easy to shovel. She filled 2 barrows before noon. Below 18 inches, the clay began, dense, heavy, and wet enough to cling to the blade. Each shovelful weighed twice what the topsoil had weighed. Her shoulders burned before she reached 2 feet. By the end of the first day, she had opened a cut 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and barely 2 feet deep. She needed a cut 40 yards long and 5 feet deep. She sat on the edge of the trench at dusk and did the arithmetic. At this pace, she would finish in 120 days. She had perhaps 50 before the ground became unworkable. The math said failure. The math had said failure since August. But now the failure had a shape, a shallow scratch in the earth that looked nothing like a passage and everything like a grave. She went inside and ate cold beans from the pot and sharpened the shovel and went to bed without lighting the lamp. The mockery reached Pike's store by the end of the week. Rufus H. Pike was 46 years old, a man built of ledger lines and leverage. He had come to the Powder River Valley not to ranch, but to supply ranchers, which meant he profited from their ambition and their failure in equal measure. He extended credit freely in spring and collected aggressively in autumn. He held notes on half the homesteads within 20 miles, and every note came with terms that favored the holder. Pike did not need Marit's claim. He needed her horses. Draft animals in good condition were worth $80 to $120 a head to the right buyer. 8 horses represented a small fortune walking around on a dead man's grass, and Pike had already told a traveling stock buyer from Cheyenne that the Brecka team might be available by January. Her failure was not merely expected, it was priced in. The laughter started over tobacco. 2 cowboys from Tolliver's outfit buying plug heard from Knowles, who had not meant it as gossip, only as wonder, that the widow Brecka was digging a trench from her cabin to her barn. They told Pike. Pike repeated the story to the next 3 customers who walked through his door, and by the following Saturday, half the valley knew about what Pike called the prairie dog hallway. The phrase was precise in its cruelty. It made Marit an animal. It made her work a burrow. It made the idea of connecting a house to a barn underground sound not just impractical, but ridiculous. The kind of thing only a woman unfamiliar with real winter would attempt. Pike held the confrontation in his store, where he had an audience. Marit had come for supplies, nails, lamp wicks, and 2 extra shovels. Not oats, not flour, not the things a person preparing for winter in the usual way would buy. Pike made a show of writing the order in his ledger, reading each item aloud. Nails, 20 pounds. Lamp wicks, 6. Shovels, 2. He looked up. No feed? Not today, Marit said. Your horses eat today the same as every day. They eat what I have. Pike set his pencil down and leaned forward on the counter. 3 men stood near the stove, listening. Mrs. Brecka, I have a reasonable offer. $20 a head for 2 of the draft horses. Good animals. I have a buyer who will take them to Cheyenne in 2 weeks. That is $40 in your hand, enough to clear half your account and buy proper feed for the rest. $20 is not what those horses are worth, Marit said. $20 is what those horses are worth to a woman who cannot feed them. The 3 men by the stove shifted their weight. One of them, a young cowboy named Lem, grinned at his boots. You can keep the little cow in whatever hole you are building, Pike said. I'm offering you a way to get through winter with your claim intact and your pride only slightly bruised. Marit counted coins from a leather pouch and placed them on the counter. 1 pound of coffee, she said, and please write the nail quantity correctly in your ledger. It is 20 pounds, not 12. Pike's expression tightened. The correction was small, but public. A storekeeper who shorted on his own records was a storekeeper who could not be trusted, and every man by the stove heard it. He wrote the number. He wrapped the coffee. He did not repeat his offer. But as Marit loaded the shovels into her wagon, Pike followed her to the door and said one more thing, quiet enough that the men inside could hear it but pretend they hadn't. "I hold your feed note, Mrs. Brecka. $76.50. That note is payable at my discretion. If I decide you are a risk, I can call it in before Christmas." Marit climbed onto the wagon seat. "Then I'd better not be a risk," she said. Pike watched her drive away. His face held the particular stillness of a man who has revealed his hand too early and knows it. The following week, Pike made his position formal. He sent word through Niels that no further store credit would be extended to the Bricky claim unless Marit signed a lien on the horses. The lien would give Pike the right to seize 2 animals if the debt was not cleared by the 1st of December. Marit refused the lien on the animals. She offered instead to sign only for the feed already purchased. The $76.50 already owed, already documented, already on the books. Nothing new. No lien on living stock. Pike accepted because he had no choice. The existing debt was already his leverage. A lien she refused was worth nothing. A debt she acknowledged in writing was worth whatever he chose to make of it later. But the confrontation had changed the equation. Pike now had a reason to want Marit's failure, not merely expect it. If she survived winter with her horses intact, his note was worth $76. If she failed, the horses were worth $800 on the open market. Her success cost him $700 in unrealized profit. The Valley did not know this math, but Marit did. She had watched Pike's eyes when she corrected his ledger. That was not the face of a man who wanted fair payment. That was the face of a man who had already spent the money her horses would bring him. She drove home with 20 pounds of nails, 6 lamp wicks, 2 shovels, and the knowledge that the ground she was digging into was not the most dangerous thing beneath her feet. Day 6 of digging. 12 feet of trench open, no roof yet. The walls stood clean where the clay was dense, crumbling where sand veins ran through. Marit learned to read the soil by color. Brown clay held, yellow clay slumped, gray clay wept water. She shored the weak spots with flat stones wedged against the walls and marked them with chalk for later timbering. Her hands bled through the gloves by the 3rd day. She wrapped them with strips of flour sacking and kept cutting. The clay clung to the shovel blade so that every 4th stroke required stopping to scrape the steel clean with a stick. The pile of excavated earth grew beside the trench like a low brown wall, and she learned to throw the dirt far enough that it would not slide back in during the night. Beret came on the 7th day. She did not ride. She walked 4 miles carrying a cloth sack with a soil probe, a thin iron rod with a T-handle, and a jar of rendered tallow for Marit's hands. She said nothing about the trench for 20 minutes. She walked its length, knelt at the edges, pressed the probe into the undug ground ahead, and pulled it back to examine the clay on the tip. Then she knelt inside the trench at the 12-foot mark and pressed her hand flat against the wall. "The clay is good here," she said, "but ahead, past the halfway mark, I feel gravel. Gravel drains. That is good for the floor but bad for the walls. You will need uprights there." "Cottonwood?" Marit asked. "Cottonwood is soft. It will rot in 2 years. But you do not have 2 years of time. You have 6 weeks. Beret stood and wiped her hands on her apron. "Cut cottonwood. Set it now. Replace it with cedar when you find cedar." She stayed the rest of the day. She did not dig. She measured. She drove the soil probe at intervals along the chalk line and recorded the resistance in scratches on a flat piece of bark. Her own notation, unreadable to anyone who had not watched her make it. By evening, she had mapped the soil for the full 40 yards, dense clay for the first 20, gravel-laced clay for the next 12, and hard-packed gravel over clay for the final 8 near the barn. "The barn end will need the most shoring," Beret said, "and that is where you put the gravel sump. Water wants to go there anyway. Let it." Marit wrote Beret's instructions on the flour sack below her own drawing, crown the roof, slope the floor, shore the gravel section, sump at the barn end, keep the passage small. Beret put on her gloves and picked up the soil probe. "I will come back in 4 days," she said. Do not dig past the 20-foot mark until I see the walls. She walked south into the dusk, 4 miles home in the dark, at 61 years old, because she had seen something in Marit's trench that she recognized. Not desperation. Measurement. The young woman cut square corners and checked her depth with a knotted string. She tested the wall with her knuckles before moving forward. She measured before she dug. Beret had not promised to dig. She had not promised anything. But she came back in 4 days, and she brought a second shovel and a coil of rope, and she did not explain why. Day 11. First cottonwood upright set in the gravel section. Marit and Beret cut 6 trees from the creek bottom, stripped them with draw knives, and sank them 3 feet into the trench floor. The uprights stood like ribs in a broken chest, waiting for the cross poles that would become the roof. Day 16. 31 feet of trench open. Then rain came from the south, a cold soaking rain that lasted 9 hours. By morning, the east wall at the 24-foot mark had slumped inward, dumping 300 pounds of wet clay into the trench floor. 2 days of digging erased in one night. Marit stood at the edge and stared at the collapse. The brown slurry filled the trench to ankle depth. The upright she had set in that section tilted 15 degrees from true. One had cracked. She did not speak for a long time. Then she climbed into the trench with a bucket and started bailing. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had someone doubt the work because they could not yet see what it was becoming? Day 22. Beret arrived and found Marit digging past the weak section instead of fixing it. Beret did not raise her voice. She simply stood at the trench edge and did not move until Marit looked up. Stop digging, Beret said. I am behind. You are behind because you are building forward on a broken foundation. Shore the weak section now or lose everything behind it the next time it rains. Marit threw the shovel onto the excavated pile. The sound was flat and final. She knew Beret was right. She had been digging past the problem because facing it meant admitting she had lost 4 days she could not afford to lose. They spent 3 days rebuilding the collapsed section. Beret showed Marit how to brace the weak wall with horizontal poles, wedged between uprights, creating a lattice that distributed the soil pressure instead of letting it push inward at a single point. The lattice held, the wall held, but 3 days were gone. Day 29, the halfway point. 20 yards of trench open, shored where needed, floor sloped, walls standing, 20 yards to go. The first hard freeze arrived that night. Marit woke to find the water bucket in the cabin crusted with ice a 1/4 inch thick. 6 weeks of digging, 20 yards left, and the ground was about to turn to stone. She sharpened both shovels until the edges caught lamplight like knife blades, wrapped her hands in fresh cloth, and went outside into air cold enough to make her teeth ache. The earth was harder than yesterday. Every stroke of the shovel sent a shock through her wrists and into her shoulders. The clay no longer peeled away in satisfying curls. It fractured in brittle chunks that flew sideways and struck her shins. She was not digging anymore. She was breaking. Behind her, 20 yards of covered trench. Ahead, 20 yards of frozen ground. Above, a sky the color of slate, pressing down like a hand. She swung the shovel. The blade rang against the clay like iron striking iron. Winter was not coming. Winter was here. And she was only halfway home. The freeze changed everything about the work. What had been labor became punishment. Each shovelful of frozen clay required 2 blows to break and a third to pry loose, and the chunks came out jagged and heavy, sharp enough to slice through glove leather. Marit's wrists swelled. Her fingers locked into a curled position at night and had to be forced open each morning by pressing them flat against the warm stovetop. She lost a thumbnail on day 31 when the shovel handle twisted in her grip and the iron edge caught her hand against the trench wall. She wrapped the finger in a strip of petticoat and kept digging. Beret came every 3rd day now. She did not dig. Her back would not allow it, and she said so plainly without apology, but she did things Marit could not do alone. She measured the slope of the floor with a length of twine and a small stone weight, adjusting the grade where Marit's eye had drifted. She tested the uprights by pushing against them with both hands, marking the ones that gave even slightly with a charcoal X, that meant they needed bracing. She sorted the cottonwood poles Marit had cut for roofing, rejecting any with visible rot or a bend greater than 2 inches over 8 feet. A bent pole sheds its load to one side, Beret said, holding a crooked piece at arm's length. The soil does not care that you are tired. It pushes where you are weakest. Day 33, 26 feet left to dig. The temperature dropped below freezing every night now and stayed there until mid-morning. The trench walls wept less because the moisture in the clay had begun to crystallize, which made the walls harder but also more brittle. Marit learned to listen for the sound of fracture, a faint ticking noise, like a fingernail tapping glass. That meant a section was about to calve off. When she heard it, she stepped back. Twice the sound saved her from standing where a 40-pound slab of frozen clay fell. Progress slowed to 7 feet a day, then 5, then 3. The arithmetic grew vicious. 3 feet a day for 26 feet was 9 more days, and that assumed no setbacks, no weather stops, no collapses. November was eating the calendar one morning at a time. Day 35. Beret arrived and did something she had not done before. She climbed down into the trench at the far end near the barn and stood with her hands on the walls, eyes closed, for a long time. Marit watched from the halfway point and said nothing. "The gravel starts here," Beret said finally. She stamped her boot on the trench floor, and a hollow sound came back. "You're close to the water table. Not in it, but close. Dig the sump now before you go any farther. 2 feet deeper than the floor, 2 feet across, packed with the biggest gravel you can carry. If water comes up during a thaw, it goes there first." They spent the rest of that day building the sump. Marit hauled gravel from the creek bed in a barrow, 40 pounds at a time, making 12 trips before the light failed. The sump was ugly, a rough pit at the barn end of the trench, packed with river stones. But when Beret poured a bucket of water onto the trench floor 10 feet from the sump, the water found the slope and ran toward the stones and disappeared. "Good," Beret said. It was the first time she had used that word about any part of the passage. Tolliver came back on day 38. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the trench edge on horseback, looking down at Marit, who was shoulder deep in the earth, face streaked with clay dust, hair tied back with a leather cord that had once been a bootlace. He dismounted and walked the length of the open trench, which was now 32 feet long and fully shored for the first 20. He looked at the cottonwood uprights, the horizontal braces on the weak wall, the crude but level floor with its barely perceptible slope toward the barn. He looked at the stack of roof poles waiting along the south side of the trench. "Who taught you to shore a wall?" he asked. "Beret Vangen." "The midwife." He said it without inflection, but the implication was clear. A midwife was not a builder. "She built a cowhouse in Wisconsin," Marit said. "Underground. It stood for 12 years. Tolliver knelt at the trench edge and examined the nearest upright. He wrapped his hand around the cottonwood and pushed. The post held. He pushed harder. It held. He stood and walked to the spot where the roof poles were stacked, spacing them with his eye. "These are too far apart," he said. Marit climbed out of the trench. "They are spaced at 24 inches. For dry soil, that might hold. This is not dry soil. By January, that earth will be saturated with snowmelt pressing down from the top. Wet soil weighs a third more than dry, and if a horse walks above the passage, your horses will cross this line between the corral and the water trough. A 1,200-pound animal on 24-inch spaced poles over wet soil will break through." He pointed at the section nearest the barn. "Here, where the animals cross, 18-inch spacing, heavier poles. The thickest cottonwood you can find, or better yet, a few lengths of cedar if you can get it." Marit looked at the stack of poles she had already cut. Half of them were sized for 24-inch spacing. Changing to 18 inches near the barn meant cutting more poles, which meant more trips to the creek bottom, which meant more days. "You're telling me to tear out work I have already done," she said. Tolliver met her eyes. "I am telling you that the work you have done is not strong enough. You can be angry about that, or you can fix it." He mounted and gathered his reins. "I do not think this passage of yours will work," he said. "But if you're going to build it anyway, build it so it does not kill you." He rode away into a wind that had turned north. Marit stood at the trench edge and looked at the poles. She counted them. She counted the days. She counted the distance still to dig. The numbers argued with each other the way they always did, each one demanding time that the others had already claimed. She pulled 6 poles from the stack and carried them to the creek to exchange for heavier ones. 3 days of work, repositioned. She thought of Tolliver's face when he pushed the upright and it held, and she thought of his voice when he said 18 inches, and she recognized something she had not expected. He was not dismissing the passage. He was correcting it, and correction from a man like Tolliver was closer to belief than anything he would say aloud. The sabotage came on day 40. Marit returned from cutting poles at the creek bottom to find the trench gate, a simple board she had fitted across the barn end opening to keep debris out, lying flat on the ground. The board had not fallen. The leather hinges were intact. Someone had lifted it off and laid it aside. Sleet had been falling for an hour. Water was running into the low section of the trench in a steady stream, pooling in the passage where the roof poles had not yet been laid. 2 inches of brown water covered the floor for a stretch of 8 feet. She found boot prints in the mud near the gate. Small boots. Boys' boots. Pike had sent 2 of his stock boys to retrieve a stove collar fitting that he claimed Torgrim had bought on credit and never paid for. The fitting was worth perhaps 30 cents. The boys had come while Marit was at the creek, taken the fitting from a nail inside the barn, and left the trench gate open on their way out. Whether the gate was left open deliberately or through carelessness did not matter. The result was the same. Marit bailed water by lantern until her arms would not lift the bucket. She emptied 96 buckets, she counted, before the floor was clear enough to check for damage. The east wall had softened in one spot where the clay met a sand vein, and a crack ran from the floor to within a foot of the surface. She packed it with gravel and tamped it with the flat of the shovel, but the repair was temporary. If the crack expanded during the next freeze, the wall could split. Beret arrived at dawn and found Marit asleep in the trench, sitting upright against the west wall with an empty bucket in her lap. Beret woke her by touching her shoulder and saying nothing until Marit's eyes focused. "Who opened the gate?" Beret asked. Marit told her. Beret looked at the crack, at the repaired wall, at the 96 bucket marks in the mud where Marit had dumped the water. She said something in Norwegian that Marit's father would have recognized but would not have repeated in front of his daughter. "Pike's fitting is worth a quarter," Beret said. "Your wall is worth your life. He knows this." They spent the morning reinforcing the damaged section. Beret showed Marit a technique she had learned in Wisconsin, packing a double layer of willow withes between the wall and a horizontal brace, creating a flexible mat that could absorb pressure without cracking the way rigid shoring did. The willow was not strong, but it was forgiving, and forgiveness was what the wall needed. By noon, the repair was done. Marit fitted a new gate with a drop bar latch that could not be lifted without tools. Day 44. Niels Moen appeared with a wagon load of gravel. He did not knock on the cabin door. He simply drove his wagon to the barn end of the trench, unhitched, and began shoveling gravel into a pile near the sump. Marit heard the sound from inside the passage, the rattle of stones hitting stones, a sound she knew as intimately as her own breathing by now, and climbed out through the cabin trapdoor to find Niels sweating through his shirt in the November cold. "The creek bed was in my way," he said without looking at her. The creek bed was 2 miles from his claim and in no one's way. The gravel was sorted, large stones on the bottom of the wagon, finer gravel on top, which meant he had spent at least half a day loading it by hand. Niels Moen, who thought the tunnel was wasted effort, had hauled 1,000 pounds of drainage gravel to the woman he thought was digging a road twice. Marit did not thank him. She understood that thanks would require him to admit what he was doing, and admitting what he was doing would require him to admit that the passage might work, and admitting that the passage might work would require him to reconsider everything he believed about winter, about labor, about what one woman alone could accomplish. So she picked up a shovel and helped him unload, and neither of them said a word until the wagon was empty. Niels climbed back onto the seat and gathered his reins. Then he paused. "The floor near the cabin end," he said. "It is warmer than the air outside." He drove away. The last 8 yards were the worst. The ground near the barn sat over a bed of compacted gravel that rang like crockery under the shovel blade. Every foot of depth required a pick as well as a shovel, and the pick handle cracked twice before Marit wrapped it with wire and rawhide. The uprights in this section had to be sunk into gravel, which meant digging post holes 18 inches deeper than the trench floor and packing them with rocks to hold the timbers upright. Beret was there for the final push. She had been coming every other day since the sabotage, staying longer each time, sleeping in Marit's cabin on a pallet near the stove. She did not pretend this was casual. She said plainly that she was old, and the walk was long and the days were short, and if Marit had room, she would stay until the passage was done or the weather made travel impossible. They worked in silence for hours at a stretch, communicating by gesture. A pointed finger for a misaligned pole, an open hand for a tool request, a fist wrapped against timber to test its ring. Beret cut willow brush for the roof layer while Marit laid poles. They developed a rhythm. Marit placed a pole across the uprights. Beret spread brush over it. Marit shoveled a layer of hay. Beret packed sod on top, and both of them shoveled earth over the sod until the roof was buried under 3 feet of packed soil. The roof went on in sections following the digging. By day 48, the passage was complete from cabin to barn. 40 yards of covered trench, 5 feet from floor to roof crown, 3 feet wide at the bottom, 4 at the shoulder. The cabin trapdoor fitted square and tight. The barn hatch opened upward on iron hinges Marit had bought with 4 of her $43. A draft shutter made of 2 overlapping boards controlled the airflow at the barn end. A second emergency hatch, Beret's insistence, opened near the barn through a short vertical shaft covered with a weighted board. "One door in a storm is a coffin," Beret had said when Marit questioned the extra work. Marit did not question it again. The tunnel was complete by the last week of November. It smelled of damp earth, dry hay, and the faint, warm breath of horses filtering through the draft shutter from the barn. Marit descended through the kitchen trapdoor with a lantern and walked the full length. The flame held steady at the cabin end, where the air was still and faintly warm. At the midpoint, it flickered once, responding to a seam in the roof where 2 poles did not meet perfectly. At the barn end, it wavered in the draft that crept past the shutter, carrying the smell of horse and manure and the sweetness of oat mash. She tested the passage the way Beret had taught her. Lantern first, to check for dead air or backdraft. Then a bucket of water poured on the floor at the highest point, watching it travel the slope to the sump. Then a night spent with the trapdoor open and the draft shutter cracked, measuring how the air moved. The results came through small changes she could see and feel. The cabin floor near the trapdoor no longer froze milk solid overnight. A crock of water left by the tunnel wall formed skin ice on its surface, but stayed liquid beneath. Cold, but not frozen. The barn stayed calmer because Marit could enter through the hatch without opening the main doors, which meant no blast of wind to spook the horses. They learned the sound of her latch, the particular scrape and click, and they turned toward the hatch before she appeared, 8 heavy heads swinging in lantern light. The horses were the engine Marit had not explained to the skeptics. Each animal, standing quietly in the barn, radiated heat, near 100 degrees of living warmth, 12 hours a day, passively, without fuel, without labor. 8 horses meant 8 furnaces breathing into a connected space. The barn air, warmed by their bodies, drifted through the draft shutter into the passage. The passage, insulated by 3 feet of earth, carried that air slowly toward the cabin. The cabin floor, pressed against the earth above the passage, stayed warmer than the walls, warmer than the windows, warmer than any surface not directly beside the stove. The system was not a heater. It was a blanket. The earth held what the horses gave, and the passage moved it where Marit needed it, and the cabin received it without asking and without waste. Tolliver came by on an afternoon when the sky was low and gray. He stood in the barn and looked at the hatch and the draft shutter and the calm horses and said nothing for a full minute. Mild cold proves nothing, he said. I know, Marit said. December is not January. I know that too. He left. Pike came the following day, uninvited, and stood in Marit's yard looking at the buried line of the passage, visible only as a slight rise in the earth between cabin and barn. He prodded the rise with his boot. You have built an expensive cellar you cannot eat, he said. He was smiling, but the smile did not reach his jaw. His jaw was tight. He had expected the passage to fail during construction. It had not failed. This was not part of his arithmetic. Niels noticed the floor warmth on his next visit. He stepped inside the cabin to return a borrowed awl and stopped 2 steps from the door, looking down. Your floor, he said. What about it? Niels knelt and pressed his hand flat against the boards near the trap door. He held it there for 5 seconds, then pressed it against the boards near the window. He looked at Marit. She saw the question form in his face, and then retreat. He stood, returned the awl, and left without saying the word he had been about to say. A newspaper scrap reached the valley in early December, brought by a freighter who had come from the south. Storms had struck western Kansas and Nebraska. Cattle were already drifting where snow had crusted over grass, which meant the grass beneath was unreachable. The telegraph wires between Dodge City and Denver had been unreliable for a week. Nobody knew exactly what was coming, but the freighter said the men at the last station had been stacking wood like they expected not to see spring. Beret heard the news and went quiet. That evening she sat by Marit's stove and touched the frost crystals that had formed on the inside of the barn hatch, where warm, moist air from the passage met the cold metal of the hinges. Warmth is moving, Beret said, rubbing the crystals between her fingers. So is water. Remember both. The frost was evidence of 2 things at once. The passage was working, carrying warm air from the barn toward the cabin, and the moisture in that warm air would condense and freeze wherever it met cold surfaces. The hatch hinges, the draft shutter frame, the underside of the roof poles near the barn end. Every place where warm met cold would grow ice, and ice was weight, and weight was pressure, and pressure was the thing that broke tunnels. Marit lay in the dark that night and listened to the wind testing the cabin walls. The trapdoor near the stove was closed. Beneath it, 40 yards of earth and timber waited for the thing everyone had been talking about since August. The test was coming. The only question was whether it would come gently enough to teach her, or all at once, hard enough to prove Tolliver right. It did not come gently. The storm arrived on a night in January when the sky had been clear since dusk. Marit had fed the horses at sundown and closed the barn hatch and climbed back through the passage and latched the trap door and set water on the stove for tea. Beret was asleep on the pallet near the wall. She had come 3 days before to help seal the barn hatch frame with tallow, and had stayed because a cough had settled in her chest that rattled when she breathed. It was not a mild cough. It came from deep in the lungs and produced a sound like tearing cloth, and each bout left Beret gray-faced and gripping the edge of the pallet with both hands. At 9 o'clock, the wind changed direction. It did not shift gradually. It swung from southwest to northwest in the time it took Marit to cross the cabin floor, and when it hit the north wall, the stove smoke reversed and came down the pipe in a gray plume that filled the room with the smell of creosote and ash. Marit opened the stove door, and the smoke poured out at floor level, heavy and thick. She closed the door. The wind had turned the chimney into a plug. Outside, the barn bell she had tied to the latch rang once. Then it rang again. Then it began ringing without pattern, a disjointed clanging that meant the wind was hitting it from multiple directions. Wind that changes direction that quickly is not weather. It is architecture. It is building something. Marit opened the cabin door 1 inch and looked out. Snow was not falling. Snow was moving, horizontally, then diagonally upward from the ground, then in spirals that caught the lantern light and made the air look solid. The barn was 40 yards away. She could not see it. She could not see the corral fence, which was 12 yards away. She could see the first fence post, barely, a dark smear in the white, and beyond it nothing, nothing at all. She shut the door and latched it. Beret was awake, sitting upright on the pallet, her face the color of ash. "How bad?" she asked. "I cannot see the barn." "Then you do not open that door again." The stove was useless with the chimney reversed. The cabin temperature began to drop immediately. Marit could feel it on her face first, the skin tightening, the moisture in her nostrils turning sharp. She pulled every blanket off the bed and wrapped Beret in two of them. Beret protested. Marit did not listen. The tunnel. The tunnel was the only path to the horses, and the horses needed feeding, and the barn hatch needed checking, and if the horses panicked and broke through the barn wall, they would be dead before morning, and the tunnel was the only warmth now, too, because the stove could not draw, and the cabin floor above the passage was the last surface in the building that held any heat. Marit opened the trapdoor. Warm air rose from the passage, not hot, not comfortable, but warmer than the cabin by 15 or 20 degrees. The horses were doing what horses do, standing, breathing, radiating. 8 animals in an enclosed barn, generating heat that the earth carried through the passage and offered up through the open hatch like a gift from below the world. She descended with a lantern, a bucket of mash, and a wool scarf pulled over her mouth and nose. The passage walls pressed close. She could touch both sides with her elbows. The floor was damp, but not flooded. Beret's slope was working, the water moving toward the sump. The air smelled of clay and horse, and something else, something she had not noticed before. The faint mineral scent of frost releasing from soil that was slightly warmer than the ground above it. The earth was exhaling. Halfway through the passage, she heard a sound, a low groan, deep and sustained, like a large animal shifting in its sleep. It came from above. Not collapse. The roof poles were solid, the uprights braced, the earth packed, but the soil was settling. The weight of snow accumulating on the surface was pressing down, compacting the already heavy earth, and the timber was taking the load with a sound that made Marit's stomach drop. She kept walking. She reached the barn hatch and pushed it open. The barn was chaos held in check by walls. 2 of the horses were sweating, their necks dark and slick, their eyes showing white. They had heard the wind and felt the pressure change, and every instinct told them to run, but there was nowhere to run. The other 6 stood pressed together in the center of the barn, heads low, breathing in unison. The barn walls creaked with each gust. Snow was finding every crack, every gap between boards, and forming thin white lines on the inside of the walls like veins. Marit fed them. She moved between the animals with the mash bucket, speaking low, touching necks and flanks, steadying the 2 frightened ones by standing close enough that they could feel her weight and warmth. She checked the water trough. Not frozen, not yet. The horse heat keeping the barn above freezing, and broke the skin ice that had formed on the surface. Then she saw the top vent. She had built it into the barn roof on Beret's instruction, a small opening covered by a hinged board that allowed moisture to escape. The board was banging in the wind, open and closed, and each time it opened, a blast of snow and air hit the barn ceiling and dropped the temperature for 3 seconds before the board slammed shut again. Beret's warning, warmth is moving, and so is water. If the vent stayed open, the moisture from 8 breathing horses would freeze on every surface inside the barn, the walls, the rafters, the hatch frame. If the vent stayed closed, the moisture would build until the air was so damp the animals' lungs would struggle. Marit climbed onto a hay bale, then onto the side rail of a stall and reached the vent. She could not close it entirely. She wedged a folded piece of burlap into the opening, leaving a gap the width of 2 fingers, enough to breathe, not enough to lose. She climbed down. One of the cows was standing oddly, her hind legs wide, her tail raised. Marit recognized the posture before she saw the fluid on the straw. The cow was calving. Now, in the middle of the worst storm the Powder River Valley had seen in years, with the barn temperature dropping every time the vent banged, with Beret coughing blood in the cabin, with the wind outside turning the world into a white void, this cow had decided to bring something new into it. Marit had 2 choices: stay in the barn and deliver the calf, or return through the tunnel to tend Beret. She could not do both at the same time, and the tunnel was 40 yards long, and each trip took 4 minutes, and the cow's labor was advancing with the particular urgency of an animal that knows it is in danger. She chose the cow first. She cleared a space in the straw, brought warm water from the trough in a bucket, and knelt behind the animal. The calf came wrong, one leg forward, one leg back, and Merritt had to reach inside and reposition the second leg while the cow bellowed and strained. Her hands were slick with fluid, and her knees were soaked, and the barn groaned around her like a ship in a gale. The calf slid free in a rush of heat and blood and landed on the straw, and Merritt cleared its mouth and nose and rubbed its ribs with a handful of rough sacking until it coughed and breathed. It was alive. Small and wet and shaking, but alive. She left the cow licking the calf and descended into the tunnel. 4 minutes back to the cabin. She emerged through the trapdoor to find Beret sitting upright, a cloth pressed to her mouth. The cloth was spotted with blood. "The calf?" Beret asked. "Alive." "The horses?" "Alive." Beret nodded. She did not ask about the storm. She could hear it. Stay with this story now, because the tunnel has stopped being an experiment and become the only line between life and loss. Merritt made 3 more trips through the tunnel that night. Each time the passage groaned above her, the sound of soil compacting under snow. Each time the barn hatch was harder to push open because blown snow was packing around the frame. On the 3rd trip, the hatch would not move. She threw her shoulder against it twice before it cracked free, and when it opened, a cascade of snow fell into the passage entrance, and she had to shovel it clear before she could enter the barn. She fed the horses again at midnight. She watered the calf. She checked the vent. She listened to the barn walls and counted the intervals between the worst gusts, timing them the way a person times contractions, waiting for the gap that meant the peak had passed. The gap did not come. The wind held its fury through the night, constant and roaring, and by the 3rd hour Merritt had stopped thinking about whether the tunnel would hold and started thinking about what she would do if it did not. Outside, the valley was dying. Niels Moen tried to cross the 60 feet between his cabin and his cattle shed at midnight. He made it 30 feet before the wind knocked him to his knees. He crawled the rest, reaching the shed with frost on his eyelashes and his hands too numb to work the latch. He lost 2 calves before morning, one frozen against the shed wall, one smothered in a drift that formed inside the shed where a board had blown loose. His cow survived because she was large enough to generate her own warmth in the enclosed space, but her milk froze in the pail. Tolliver's men could not reach the lower pasture where 200 head of cattle stood in the open. The riders tried at dawn and turned back after a quarter mile. The snow was not deep yet. The wind was moving it too fast for it to settle, but the air was so thick with blown ice that the horses refused to face it. By the 2nd day, Tolliver's cattle had drifted south with the wind, piling against fence lines and creek banks where the snow buried them standing up. In Pike's rented lot behind the store, 30 head of mixed stock crowded the fence on the lee side. The fence was not built for the weight of 30 animals pressing against it. A section gave way after midnight, and the cattle walked through the gap into the storm. Pike found 7 of them alive 3 days later. The rest were scattered across 2 miles of open ground, frozen where they stopped. Someone nearly died. Arne Flatten was 23 years old, a rider on Tolliver's crew, born in a sod house on the Platte River and raised on horseback. He had been sent to check the north fence line before the storm reached full force and had not returned. At dawn on the 2nd day, after the wind dropped from a scream to a moan, Niels Moen found Arne lying against the outside wall of Merritt's barn. He was not conscious. His left hand was white to the wrist. His horse was gone, bolted or dead, no one knew. Niels pounded on Merritt's cabin door, but the drifts had buried it to the latch and she could not open it from inside. She heard his shouting through the wall and descended into the tunnel and emerged through the barn hatch and found Niels kneeling over Arne in snow that reached their knees. They could not carry him through the main barn door. The drifts were chest high against it. They could not leave him outside. Merritt opened the barn hatch wide and Niels lowered Arne's body into the passage feet first. Marit guided him from below, pulling his shoulders through the opening while Niels pushed. Arne made a sound that was not a word and not a scream, but something between, and then he was inside the tunnel, lying on the damp floor in air that was 30 degrees warmer than the killing wind above. They carried him through the passage, 40 yards with Niels at the feet and Marit at the shoulders, hunched beneath the low roof, their lanterns swinging shadows across the earthen walls. Beret met them at the cabin trapdoor, coughing, and together the three of them lifted Arne into the cabin and laid him on the pallet where Beret had been sleeping. Beret examined the frozen hand with the particular calm of a woman who had seen frostbite before and knew which colors meant salvage and which meant loss. She packed the hand in cloths soaked with cool water, not warm, cool because warming too fast destroyed what cold had merely stunned, and told Marit to keep the stove burning low. The stove. The chimney had cleared during the night as the wind shifted again, and Marit had fed it with the last of the split wood. The cabin was not warm, but it was above freezing, and above freezing was the difference between Arne Flatten keeping 3 fingers or losing the hand. Outside, the storm continued for another 12 hours. Inside, beneath the ground, the tunnel held. It held through the groaning. It held through the snow packing around the barn hatch. It held through Marit's 6 trips back and forth, feeding and watering and checking the calf and clearing the hatch and listening to the roof poles creak. The crowned roof shed the meltwater sideways. The sloped floor drained the condensation to the sump. The uprights bore the weight of wet soil and accumulating snow without cracking. The willow braces on the repaired wall flexed and held. The emergency hatch near the barn, which Beret had insisted on, became the primary entrance after the main hatch froze, and it opened cleanly because its vertical shaft was sheltered from horizontal drifting. One door in a storm is a coffin. Beret had been right. After 36 hours, the wind dropped. Not slowly. It simply stopped, the way a voice stops mid-sentence, leaving a silence so sudden and complete that Marit stood in the cabin and waited for it to resume. It did not. The air outside went still, and the temperature plummeted in the clarity that follows a storm, but the wind was done. Marit opened the cabin door. It took 10 minutes to dig through the drift that had buried it. When she stepped outside, the valley was white and silent. No cattle bawling, no wagon noise, no voices. The only sound was the creak of frozen cottonwood branches along the river and the faint hiss of dry snow settling under its own weight. The barn stood. The corral fence stood, buried to the top rail, but intact. The passage line was invisible beneath the snow, a buried seam between 2 buildings that looked from above impossibly far apart. Marit walked to the nearest rise and looked south. The valley floor was smooth and white and featureless, and in that featureless white there were shapes that should not have been there, low, dark humps scattered across the snow, some alone, some clustered against fence lines and creek banks. She knew what they were. She had seen dead cattle before. She had never seen them by the dozen. The snow humps went on for as far as she could see. Some were still, some were not. The ones that were not still were dying slowly, animals too weak to rise from where the storm had pushed them, their breath making small clouds that dissipated instantly in the frozen air. She turned back toward the cabin. Inside, Beret was coughing. Arne Flatten was unconscious, but breathing. The horses stamped in the barn, impatient for morning feed. The newborn calf stood on unsteady legs and pressed its nose against its mother's flank. 40 yards beneath the snow, the passage waited. Damp, cold, smelling of earth and horse breath and survival, ready for the next trip down. Tolliver came on the 3rd day after the storm. He did not send a rider ahead. He did not send word. He rode his bay gelding through snow that reached the animal's chest in the low places and dismounted at Marit's corral gate and stood for a long time looking at the barn. The barn stood clean against the white. No collapsed walls, no broken fence rails, no dark shapes of dead animals pressed against the boards. Inside, when Tolliver opened the door, the main door, which Marit and Niels had dug clear the previous afternoon, 8 draft horses turned their heads and looked at him with the calm, liquid patience of animals that had been fed that morning. The water trough held water, not ice. The newborn calf stood in the straw beside its mother on legs that had grown steadier overnight. The barn smelled of hay and manure and the thick grassy warmth of living bodies. It smelled like survival. Tolliver walked between the stalls without speaking. He touched the neck of the nearest horse, a big sorrel mare that pressed her nose into his gloved hand. He looked at the draft shutter mounted on the wall near the hatch. He knelt and opened the hatch and looked down into the passage, where the lantern Marit had hung on a nail threw yellow light across the earthen walls. He stayed on one knee for a long time. When he stood, Marit was leaning against the stall rail behind him. She did not ask what he thought. She waited. "I was wrong about the hole," Tolliver said. His voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man selecting each word like a nail from a bin. "I was not wrong about the weight. You made it strong enough anyway." The sentence gave him what he needed, the acknowledgement that his structural concern had been legitimate, that the 18-inch spacing he demanded had mattered, while conceding the central point. The passage worked. The passage had held. The passage had saved stock that open ground had killed. Marit said, "You told me to fix the pole spacing. I fixed it." Tolliver nodded. He looked at the hatch again. "How warm is it down there?" "Come see." They descended together. Tolliver had to duck. He was tall enough that the 5-foot ceiling pressed against his hat, and he walked the full 40 yards in silence, running one hand along the wall. At the cabin end, where warm air pooled near the trap door and the earth held the slow heat of 8 horses, he stopped and spread his palm flat against the wall the way Merritt's father had done in the root cellar in Minnesota. "That is not frozen," he said. "No." "How deep is the frost line above us?" 3 feet, maybe 4 by now. Down here the soil never froze. Beret said the earth temperature holds at about 40 degrees once you go below the frost line. The horse heat warms it further. Tolliver pulled his hand away. He looked at the ceiling, the poles, the packed sod, the willow brush visible between gaps. He looked at the floor, the slope, the faint sheen of moisture moving toward the barn end. He took a breath and let it out slowly, and the breath did not cloud. Inside the tunnel in January, his breath did not cloud. "I will send 2 of my men to see this," he said. "Send them. I will show them everything." They climbed out through the kitchen trapdoor. Beret was sitting by the stove, wrapped in blankets, her face gaunt, but her eyes sharp. She watched Tolliver straighten up in the cabin and brush earth from his knees. He looked at her. "You taught her this?" he asked. "I taught her drainage," Beret said. "She taught herself the rest." Tolliver put on his hat and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the latch and turned back. "How many did you lose?" he asked Marit. "1 calf, week before the storm. The rest are alive." "I have not finished counting mine," Tolliver said. "I do not think I want to." He rode north. The valley was still silent. Smoke rose from the few chimneys that were drawing, thin lines against the white sky. The rest were dark. The numbers came in over the following week, delivered by riders and freighters and neighbors who visited each other for the first time since the storm because they needed to say the words aloud to believe them. Marit lost no horses. 1 weak calf had died before the storm, not during it. The newborn survived. All 3 milk cows survived. The barn, the cabin, and the passage were intact. Niels Moen lost 2 calves and 1 cow. The cow had been healthy before the storm, but was trapped against the shed wall when a drift packed the door shut. By the time Niels cleared it, the cow had been standing in her own frozen waste for 18 hours without water. She died 2 days later. Niels did not say this with anger. He said it with the particular quietness of a man who knows the difference between what happened to him and what happened 40 yards from his neighbor's kitchen. Pike's rented lot lost more than half its animals. Of 30 head, he recovered 7 alive, and 4 of those were frostbitten badly enough that they would not survive spring. The broken fence section had never been repaired properly. Pike had patched it with wire in October, rather than spending money on new rails, and the wire gave way under the weight of panicked cattle. The loss was Pike's fault in the way that a miser's loss is always his fault. Not because he caused the storm, but because he had saved the $3 that would have held the fence. Tolliver's losses were still being counted when February arrived. His foreman estimated that between 40 and 60% of the cattle on open range were dead. Some were buried in draws and creek bottoms where the snow had drifted 20 feet deep. Some had walked south with the wind until they hit a fence or a riverbank and piled against it and died standing. Some had simply stopped, turned their backs to the wind, and frozen where they stood. The carcasses would not be fully visible until spring. The phrase people used was the big die-up, and it carried a weight that simple words about weather could not convey. The winter of 1886 to 87 did not merely kill cattle, it killed a way of thinking. The open-range model, turn them loose, let them graze, gather what survives, had been tested by the one variable it could not accommodate, a winter that did not forgive. And in the middle of that winter, a woman with 8 horses and a covered trench had lost nothing. People came to see, not all at once, not in crowds. They came singly and in pairs, on horseback or on foot, and they came with the particular wariness of people who had been wrong about something and needed to see the proof before they could admit it. The first were Tolliver's 2 riders, sent as promised. They walked the passage end to end, touching the walls, testing the uprights, measuring the ceiling height with an outstretched arm. One of them, a man named Peter Haugen, knelt at the gravel sump and dug his hand into the stones and pulled out a fistful of wet gravel and held it up like evidence. "This is where the water goes," he said. "That is where the water goes," Marit said. "And it does not freeze?" "It freezes at the surface. Beneath the top inch, the gravel stays wet. The temperature down here does not drop below freezing." Haugen looked at the wet gravel in his hand, and then at the passage walls, and then at Marit. He was not a man accustomed to learning from women, but he was a man who had spent 3 days pulling dead cattle from snowdrifts, and the education of dead cattle is thorough. "How wide does it need to be?" he asked. The questions multiplied after that. How deep? How wide? What timber? How long to build? Whether animals panic in the passage? Whether the air goes bad? Whether rats nest in the walls? Whether the roof leaks in thaw? Whether it smells? Whether a person can stand upright or must crawl? Marit answered by showing, not telling. She took them into the passage and made them feel the temperature change with bare hands. She showed them the crowned roof and poured water on it so they could watch the water sheet sideways instead of dripping through. She opened the draft shutter and closed it and opened it again, letting them feel the difference in airflow. The slow push of warm barn air when the shutter was cracked, the stillness when it was sealed. She showed them the willow braces on the repaired wall and explained what happened when clay met sand and water found the seam. She did not lecture. She walked, and they followed, and the passage taught them what words could not. Niels came last. He waited until the riders and the neighbors had visited and left, and then he came alone on a morning when the sky was clear and the temperature had dropped below 0. He stood in the barn and looked at the hatch for a full minute before he said anything. "My calves died 60 feet from my front door," he said. Marit said nothing. 60 feet. I could throw a rock that far. I tried to reach them, and the wind put me on my knees in 30. I know. Niels descended into the passage. He walked slowly, one hand on the wall, the way a man walks through a building he is memorizing. At the midpoint, he stopped and turned to Marit, who was behind him with the lantern. "The floor's warm," he said. "Warmer than outside, not warm. Warmer than my shed. Warmer than my cabin floor." He looked at the ceiling. "Can this be built shorter? I do not need 40 yards. I need 60 feet. 60 feet is easier. The roof span is the same. The digging is less." Niels pressed his hand against the wall and held it there, the same gesture Tolliver had made, the same gesture Marit's father had made in the root cellar. People needed to feel the earth not freezing before they could believe it. "I will need help," Niels said. It was the hardest sentence he had spoken since the storm. "I know," Marit said. Beret and I will mark the line for you. Beret's cough did not improve. It settled deeper, moving from her chest to a place behind her ribs that made her wince when she breathed. She stopped walking to her own cabin and stayed full-time on the pallet in Merritt's kitchen, and the space between the stove and the wall became her country, a small territory of blankets, tea, a Norwegian Bible with a cracked spine, and the iron soil probe she kept beside the pallet like a walking stick she would not need again. But she did not stop working. She worked from the pallet, drawing passage designs for shorter buildings, calculating roof spans and drainage slopes on scraps of paper, arguing with Marit about details that would not matter for months. She revised the design for neighbors who had different terrain, different soil, different distances between buildings. A cowshed passage could be shallower, 4 feet instead of 5, because no one needed to walk upright to a building they entered only twice a day. A storm hatch did not need a full vertical shaft. A sloped ramp with a hinged cover would drain better and resist drifting. Emergency rope lines between buildings, knotted at intervals so a person could count the knots and know how far they had gone, were not a replacement for a passage, but could save a life while one was being built. Marit and Beret argued about the rope lines. Marit thought them unnecessary once a passage existed. Beret disagreed. A passage connects 2 buildings, Beret said from the pallet, her voice thin but precise. A rope connects 2 people. You cannot dig a tunnel to every place a person might need to go in a storm. You can tie a rope. A rope is not a tunnel. A rope is not a tunnel, but a person holding a rope is alive, and a person holding nothing is lost. Beret coughed, hard, and pressed the cloth to her mouth. When she lowered it, the cloth was spotted red. I did not survive to 61 by refusing to carry a rope. Marit strung rope lines the next day. From the cabin to the well curb, from the barn to the corral gate, from the corral gate to the haystack. Each line was knotted at 6-foot intervals, tight enough to grip in a gloved hand, tied to iron stakes driven deep enough that the wind could not pull them. The ropes cost her nothing but time. Beret watched from the window and nodded once when the last line was taut. Their final collaboration happened in February, when Beret was strong enough to sit at the table, but not to walk to the barn. Marit brought the soil probe inside and laid it on the table between them, and they spent an afternoon designing what Beret called a storm plan, a written sequence of actions for the next blizzard, organized by priority. Feed the horses first, check the barn hatch second, clear the emergency hatch third, conserve stove wood by using the passage warmth, keep the draft shutter cracked but not open, pack snow around the cabin trapdoor frame to insulate it from above. The plan was not complicated. It was thorough. It accounted for details that a person in the middle of a crisis would forget. The vent board, the condensation, the sump, the rope lines. And it laid them out in an order that a frightened woman working alone could follow without stopping to think. You will not need me for the next storm, Beret said when the plan was finished. I will always need you. You will always want me. That is different. Beret folded the plan and placed it under the Bible. Need means you cannot do it alone. You can. Beret Vangen died on a morning in early March when the first meltwater was running in the creek and the snow on the passage roof had thinned enough that green shoots were pushing through the sod. She died on the pallet in Marit's cabin with the stove burning low and the trapdoor closed and the sound of horses stamping in the barn coming faintly through the floor. She did not die in her sleep. She woke at dawn and asked Marit for water and drank half of it and set the cup on the floor beside the pallet. She said something in Norwegian, a sentence Marit recognized from her father's speech but could not fully translate, something about soil and patience and the weight of things that endure. Then she closed her eyes and her breathing changed from the ragged, wet sound it had been for weeks to something shallow and quiet, and in 10 minutes it stopped. Marit sat beside the pallet for an hour. She did not weep. She did not pray. She sat with her hands on her knees and looked at the soil probe leaning against the wall and the cracked Bible and the folded storm plan beneath it and the spot on the blanket where Beret's hand had rested, curled and still. The earth does not make heat. It keeps what foolish people let escape. Her father's words. Beret's lesson. The same truth spoken by two people who had understood what the ground could hold and what it could not. Marit buried Beret on the south slope of the claim, where the soil thawed first in spring and the cottonwoods gave shade in summer. She dug the grave herself, 4 feet deep, into ground that was still partially frozen. It took most of a day. Niels came and offered to help, and Marit said no, and Niels stood at a distance and waited until she was done. Beret's final instruction was not sentimental. She had told Marit 2 days before the end to stop copying old country methods blindly and build for Wyoming wind, Wyoming melt, Wyoming soil. The root cellars of Minnesota and the cow houses of Wisconsin were good starting points, but they were starting points. The Powder River Valley had its own rules: harder freezes, faster thaws, soil that shifted between clay and gravel without warning, and the passage system had to answer those rules or it would fail. "You have been building like your father," Beret said. "Build like yourself." She left Marit the soil probe and a note written in Norwegian on a piece of brown wrapping paper. Marit read it once, folded it, and placed it inside the Bible. She hung the soil probe on a nail near the stove where she could reach it without thinking. The secondary crisis came with the spring thaw, as Beret had warned it would. Niels had begun his passage in February, working through the worst of the cold because the storm had convinced him more thoroughly than any argument could. His passage was shorter, 60 feet from cabin to cattle shed, but he had dug it fast and anxious, racing the calendar the way Marit had raced it in October, and speed had cost him precision. Marit saw the problem on her first inspection. Niels had cut below a clay seam near the midpoint of his passage and struck a layer of loose sand beneath it. The sand drained well in winter, when everything was frozen. But when the thaw arrived in March and meltwater began moving through the upper soil, the sand layer became a channel. Water entered the passage from below, not above. The floor flooded from the ground up. Niels was standing ankle-deep in brown water when Marit descended into his passage. The walls were weeping, dark stains spreading across the clay surface, moisture beading and running in thin streams to the floor. 2 of his uprights had shifted as the wet sand beneath them softened. The roof creaked. "I built it the way you showed me," Niels said. His voice was tight with something between anger and fear. "You built it faster than I showed you," Marit said. She was already looking at the walls, pressing her hand against the clay, reading the moisture the way Beret had taught her. The clay above the sand seam was solid. The clay below it was saturated. The water was traveling horizontally through the sand layer, finding the passage because the passage was the lowest point on that line. "You need to give the water somewhere else to go," Marit said. "Right now the passage is the drain. We need to make a drain that is not the passage." She could hear Beret's voice in her own words. Water is not stupid. It follows the ground. The solution was not to fight the water, but to redirect it, to cut a shallow trench from the passage wall to the creek, breaking through the sand layer at an angle that let gravity do the work. They dug the drainage trench that afternoon. Marit, Niels, and Niels's boy, who was 12 and strong enough to hold a shovel. The trench was 18 inches deep and 2 feet wide and ran 30 feet from the passage wall to the creek bank. When they broke through the last foot of soil and the water found the new path, it came in a rush, brown and gritty and fast, and the passage floor dropped an inch in 20 minutes as the standing water drained. Marit packed fresh gravel into the low spots and showed Niels how to build a gravel curtain against the wall where the sand seam entered, a vertical band of river stones packed tight between 2 boards, allowing water to filter through slowly instead of running freely into the passage. By evening, the floor was damp but not flooded. The uprights were straight. The roof had stopped creaking. Pike heard about the flooding before the repair was finished. He was in his store when one of Tolliver's riders mentioned it, and Pike repeated the story 3 times before noon, with additions that grew with each telling. By the 3rd version, Niels's passage had collapsed entirely, trapping 2 calves, and the widow Brecka's design was killing stock more surely than winter. None of it was true, but truth was not Pike's currency. Leverage was. He pressed Tolliver to denounce the passages publicly, to say, as a respected cattleman, that underground corridors between buildings were hazardous and should not be copied. Tolliver refused. He had walked Marit's passage. He had felt the walls. He had seen his own riders' faces when they emerged from the far end and understood what the earth could hold. He would not denounce a thing he had touched and found sound. Pike tried a different angle. He called in Marit's debt. The note arrived on a Tuesday in late March, written in Pike's hand and delivered by the same boy who had left the trench gate open in October. $76.50, payable in full within 10 days. No extension, no partial payment, no alternative. Marit read the note at her kitchen table with the soil probe hanging on the wall behind her and the trapdoor closed beneath her feet. $76.50. She had $31 in the tin cup. The hay was gone. The horses had eaten through the winter supply, and she had supplemented with cottonwood bark stripped from the trees along the creek, a desperate measure that Tolliver's riders had seen and not commented on. She had no surplus to sell. She had no labor to hire out. She had horses, and Pike wanted horses. The 10-day deadline was Pike's weapon. Spring was the one season when Marit's draft horses were worth more than their feed. Freight season was starting. Ranches needed teams for hauling. If she could hire out the horses for even 2 weeks of spring work, she could earn the $76.50 and more. But Pike had set the deadline before the hauling contracts were signed, before the roads were clear, before anyone was hiring teams. He had chosen the 10 days precisely because they fell in the gap between winter need and spring opportunity. Share this with someone who understands that preparation is not fear. It is care made visible before trouble arrives. Marit did not panic. She sat with the note, and the $31, and the empty hay yard, and the calendar, and she worked the problem the way Beret had taught her to work soil, layer by layer, testing each assumption before moving to the next. She could not pay in full. She could not pay in part. Pike's note specified full payment, and partial payment would give him grounds to claim default. She could not sell a horse in 10 days at fair price. Pike had made sure of that by telling every buyer in the valley that Marit's stock was encumbered by debt. But she could make Pike's position more expensive than her failure. Marit rode to Tolliver's ranch the next morning. She did not ask for charity. She asked for a contract. She offered her 8-horse team for spring hauling at the standard rate, $3 a day per team, payable upon completion, with a 2-week advance of $50 against the work. The advance was unusual but not unreasonable. Tolliver needed teams. Marit had the best draft horses in the valley. The advance would let her clear Pike's note before the deadline, and the remaining hauling wages would carry her into summer. Tolliver considered the offer for 1 day. He sent word back through Hogan. $50 advance, payable immediately, against 15 days of hauling starting April 1st. The terms were fair. More than fair. They were a public rebuke to Pike, and Tolliver knew it. Marit paid Pike's note on the 8th day. She rode to the store, laid $76.50 on the counter in coins and folded bills, and asked Pike to write "paid in full" on the note and return it to her. Pike wrote the words. He did not speak. His face held the stillness of a man whose arithmetic had been wrong and who was only now understanding how much the error would cost him. He had bet on Marit's isolation. He had not accounted for the fact that a woman who saves her neighbor's stock and teaches her neighbor's methods is no longer isolated. She is owed. Marit took the note and folded it and placed it in the same pouch where she kept her remaining coins. She bought nothing else. She left the store and drove home past the valley where the snow was melting and the dark shapes of dead cattle were emerging from the white like a slow, terrible inventory of everything the open range had cost. 3 families asked Marit to mark passage lines before the ground thawed enough to dig. She walked each property with the soil probe, testing the ground the way Beret had tested hers, pressing the iron rod into the earth, reading the resistance, mapping the clay and the gravel and the sand. She drew plans on flour sacks and brown paper, adjusting each design for the terrain. One family needed a short passage from a cabin to a chicken house. Shallow, narrow, barely 4 feet deep. Another needed a longer run to a lambing shed with a wider section at the midpoint for storing feed. A third wanted nothing more than a storm hatch and a rope line, because their buildings were too far apart for a passage, and they knew it. Marit did not charge for the plans. She did not refuse when two of the families insisted on paying, one with a smoked ham, one with $3 in coin, and a promise of fence labor in June. The payments were not compensation. They were respect, offered in the only currency the valley recognized, the admission that someone else knew something you did not. The teaching was not easy. A neighbor named Solheim wanted his passage wide enough to drive a handcart through. Marit refused. A cart-width passage needs a roof span of 5 feet, she said. 5 feet of unsupported span in wet soil needs timbers you cannot cut alone and a crown you cannot pack alone. The roof will sag in the first thaw and collapse in the second. Solheim argued. He was a large man who did not enjoy being told what he could not build by a woman half his size. Marit let him argue until he was finished and then said, "Build it wide and I will not help you. Build it to 3.5 feet and I will mark every upright." Solheim built it to 3.5 feet. Another neighbor, a man named Kittelson, wanted no vent in his passage because vents let cold in. Marit took him into her own tunnel and showed him the underside of the roof poles near the barn end, where frost had formed in feathery crystals an inch thick. "That is breath," she said. 8 horses breathing 12 hours a day. The moisture has to go somewhere. Without a vent, it goes into the wood. The wood rots. The rot weakens. The roof fails. She scraped the frost with her fingernail and held the wet finger up for Kittelson to see. "A vent lets cold in. It also lets this out. Choose which you would rather live with." Kittelson built a vent. The design spread not because they were revolutionary, but because they were practical. They required no materials that could not be found within a day's ride. They required no skills beyond digging, cutting, and measuring. They required no money beyond what a person might spend on nails and lamp oil. They required only labor, and labor was the one thing every homesteader had in surplus. The phrase prairie dog hallway still circulated, but the tone had changed. When Tolliver's men used it, they used it the way a person uses a nickname that has outlived its joke, with familiarity, without malice, and with the faint awareness that the name now described something real. The prairie dog hallway had held through the worst storm in living memory. The laughing men's cattle had not. Marit heard the phrase once more, from a freighter passing through in April. He used it as a question. "You are the one with the prairie dog hallway." She said yes. He asked if it was true that she had walked under the snow to feed her horses while the wind killed everything above. She said yes. He asked how deep. She said 5 feet. He said he had a sister in Nebraska with a soddy and a cow barn 40 feet apart, and did Marit think a passage could be built in that soil? Marit said she did not know Nebraska soil, but she knew the questions to ask about it. She gave him the soil probe and told him how to use it. Press it into the ground. Read the resistance. Map the layers. Find the clay. Find the gravel. Find the water. Build where the earth is willing. Do not build where it is not. The freighter took the probe and wrote Marit's instructions on a piece of brown paper and tucked it into his coat. He drove south the next morning. Marit watched his wagon disappear and realized she had given away Beret's probe and felt the loss of it in her hands like a missing finger. Niels brought her a new one 2 weeks later. He had forged it himself at his smithing bench, a thin iron rod with a T-handle, heavier than Beret's but straight and true. He did not say it was a replacement. He said his scrap pile was getting out of hand and the rod was taking up space. Marit hung it on the nail where Beret's had been. The weight was different. The balance was different. But the nail was the same nail, and the wall was the same wall, and the work was the same work. By the second autumn after the storm, the valley had changed in ways that were visible only to people who remembered what it had looked like before. The open range was quieter. Tolliver still ran cattle, but fewer and closer to his buildings. He had converted one calving shed into a winter shelter, with log walls banked with earth on 3 sides, and a covered run to the main barn. It was not a passage. Tolliver would not call it that, and Marit did not press the word, but the principle was the same. Protected access, connected warmth, animals that could be reached in any weather without crossing open ground. 4 homesteads within 10 miles of Marit's claim had built some version of the covered passage. 2 were full tunnels, dug to 5 feet, shored, roofed, and packed, connecting cabins to barns or sheds. 1 was a half-depth covered trench, only 3 feet deep, roofed with poles and sod, passable at a crouch. The 4th was simply a storm hatch and a rope line, built by the family whose buildings sat too far apart for a passage, but who had taken Marit's instructions and made them work for the distance they had. None of the passages were identical. Each answered the specific ground it was dug into: the clay here, the gravel there, the slope of the land, the direction of the prevailing wind. But all of them shared the same bones: crowned roof, sloped floor, gravel sump, shoring where the soil demanded it, and a second exit because one door in a storm is a coffin. Beret's words, spoken from a pallet, built into the earth by strangers who had never heard her voice. Marit's own operation had grown past survival into something that resembled permanence. The original passage still ran from kitchen to barn, 40 yards, 5 feet deep, smelling of clay and horse, and the particular mineral sweetness of earth that has been walked through 10,000 times. She had rebuilt sections of the roof twice, the first time replacing the cottonwood poles with cedar hauled from the mountains west of the Bighorns at a cost of $14 and 6 days of freighting. The second time reinforcing the barn end section after a wet spring caused the soil above it to settle 2 inches. But the passage was no longer alone. A root cellar spur branched off at the 20-foot mark, dropping another 2 feet into a chamber 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, walled with flat stones and roofed with cedar poles. The temperature inside held steady year-round walls, cool enough in summer to keep milk for 3 days, warm enough in winter to prevent the potato stores from freezing. Marit had dug it in the spring of 1889, working alone, applying Beret's drainage rules to a space Beret had never seen. An insulated milk room connected to the barn through a short passage of its own, 12 feet long, lined with whitewashed boards that Marit inspected every month for seepage stains and mold. The whitewash was Beret's trick, taught during one of the pallet sessions. White walls reveal moisture before the nose can smell it. A dark stain on a white board means water, and water means rot, and rot means failure. The simplicity of it was the point. You did not need instruments. You needed paint and eyes. A storm line ran from the barn to the well curb, 60 feet of buried rope anchored to iron stakes, with a covered hatch at the well end that allowed Marit to draw water without standing in the wind. The hatch was crude, a frame of planks over a hole barely large enough for a bucket, but it worked in conditions that made the walk from barn to well lethal. The whole system, seen from above, looked like nothing: a low cabin, a solid barn, flat ground between them, unmarked except for the slight rises where the buried passages lay beneath the surface. A visitor arriving in summer would see a homestead like any other. A visitor arriving in January would see the difference between this homestead and every other claim in the valley. The animals were alive, the water was flowing, and the woman who ran it walked between buildings without opening a single door to the wind. Atasmal Sedans, Pike's End did not come as a single defeat. It came as erosion, the slow wearing away of a position that had depended on other people's failure. The big die-up had broken the economics of the open range. Large outfits that had run thousands of head on public grass found themselves counting losses that reached 50, 60, 70%. The cattle that survived were thin and weak, worth a fraction of their pre-winter value. The ranchers who had bought on credit, expecting beef prices to hold, found themselves upside down, owing more than their remaining stock could repay. Pike had built his store on this system. He extended credit to ranchers and homesteaders, charged interest through higher prices, and collected in stock or land when the debts came due. The system worked as long as people failed at a predictable rate. A few defaults each year, enough to keep the shelves stocked and the ledger black. But the winter of 86 to 87 did not produce a few defaults. It produced a catastrophe. Half the ranchers in the valley owed Pike money they could not pay, and the stock they had pledged as collateral was dead under the snow. Pike could not collect from dead cattle. He could not sell feed that no one could afford. He could not hold notes against claims that had been abandoned by families who packed their wagons and drove east without looking back. His store, which had been the valley's bank and court and counting house, became a building full of goods that no one was buying and debts that no one was paying. The families who survived best were the small operators, the homesteaders with gardens and dairy stock and enough shelter to carry their animals through. The families who had built passages, storm hatches, rope lines, and covered runs. The families who had learned from Marit, or from people who had learned from Marit. These families did not owe Pike for emergency feed purchases, because they had not needed emergency feed. They did not owe him for replacement stock because they had not lost stock. They traded labor and materials among themselves, bypassing Pike's store for everything except salt, coffee, and ammunition. Pike felt the shift before he could name it. Fewer customers, smaller orders, families settling accounts in full instead of carrying balances, because carrying a balance at Pike's meant carrying Pike's leverage, and leverage was a thing the valley no longer wished to give him. He made one final attempt to reassert control. In the spring of 1888, he wrote to the territorial assessor claiming that underground passages constituted improvements that should increase the taxable value of homestead claims. The letter argued that Marit Brecka and 3 neighboring families had materially improved their properties through construction and should be reassessed accordingly. The assessor sent a man in June. The man walked Marit's property, descended into the passage, measured the root cellar, and wrote a report that assessed the improvements at $12 total, a sum so low it barely affected the tax. The report also noted that the improvements had been constructed entirely from materials found on the claim or within a day's haul, using no purchased lumber and no hired labor, which made the assessed value essentially the value of the nails and hinges. Pike's letter had accomplished the opposite of its intent. The assessor's report was now public record, and it documented, in official language, that a practical system for surviving Wyoming winters could be built for the cost of nails and hinges. The report circulated through the valley faster than Pike's gossip ever had. Pike did not close his store. He could not afford to. But the store shrank. He dropped the livestock notes. He stopped extending long credit. He raised his prices to cover the losses from the die-up and watched his customers walk past his door to trade at a new mercantile that opened 12 miles south, run by a former Tolliver hand who had seen the future and decided it did not include Rufus Pike. The last time Marit saw Pike in his store, he was inventorying shelves that were half empty. She had come for lamp oil, a transaction so small it barely required speech. Pike filled the tin and named the price, and Marit paid, and neither of them mentioned horses or tunnels or prairie dog hallways. But as she turned to leave, Pike spoke, not to her face, to the counter. "The fence would have held," he said, "if I had used rails instead of wire. The fence would have held and the cattle would have lived." Marit stopped. She recognized the sentence for what it was. Not an apology, not an admission, but the closest thing Pike's pride could produce to both. He was not saying she had been right. He was saying he had been wrong. The distinction mattered to a man like Pike the way weight mattered to a roof. The direction of the force determined whether the structure stood or fell. "Rails cost $3 more than wire," Marit said. "I know what they cost." She left the store. She did not see Pike again for several months, and when she did, he was loading a wagon in front of the building with the particular efficiency of a man who was not restocking but leaving. He sold the store in the autumn of 1889 to the man who ran the livery, and he drove south toward Cheyenne, and the valley let him go the way a river lets a stone settle, without effort, without memory, without looking back. The courtship between Marit and Niels Moen did not begin with words. It began with roof poles. In the summer of 1888, a family named Espeland asked Marit to help them mark a passage line to their lambing shed. The soil on the Espeland claim was different from anything Marit had dug before, a heavy red clay over sandstone that rang like pottery under the probe. She needed help testing the roof span limits because the clay was strong enough to hold a wider passage, but brittle enough to crack if the poles were spaced too far. Niels came to the Espeland claim on the second day. He said he was returning a borrowed harness. The harness was in his saddlebag, untouched, for the entire afternoon. He worked beside Marit without asking permission. He lifted poles she could not lift alone. He held uprights plumb while she packed gravel around the base. He did not offer advice. He did not explain how he would build it differently. He worked at her pace, followed her marks, and when she said a pole was too light, he carried it back to the pile and brought a heavier one without argument. They did not speak about the passage. They spoke about timber quality and soil color, and whether the Espeland boy was old enough to dig unsupervised. They spoke the way two people speak who are building something together and have not yet decided whether the thing they are building is a roof or a life. Niels began appearing on Marit's claim in the evenings. He brought small things: a repaired hinge, a bundle of willow withes, a sack of oats he claimed had been mislabeled at the freight office and could not be returned. Each gift was disguised as accident or surplus. Marit accepted each one without comment, which was its own kind of permission. The gravel debt stood between them like a fence. Niels had hauled 1,000 pounds of gravel to Marit's tunnel in October, and Marit had never acknowledged it as a gift, because Niels had never acknowledged it as one. The debt was imaginary. Niels owed nothing. Marit owed nothing. But it occupied a space in both their minds that was shaped exactly like the question neither of them had asked. Niels settled it in August. He rode to Marit's cabin on a Sunday afternoon, dismounted, and stood in the yard holding his hat. "I would like to pay back the gravel," he said. Marit was mending a harness on the porch. She looked up. The gravel was free. "I know. I would like to pay it back anyway." "With what?" "Coffee. On Sundays, if you are willing." Marit set the harness down. She looked at Niels standing in her yard with his hat in his hands and his horse shifting behind him, and she saw a man who had crawled through a storm to reach his own animals and lost them anyway, and who had carried a stranger through a tunnel he did not believe in, and who had forged an iron probe to replace one that an old woman had left behind. She saw a man who had been wrong about the passage and right about the gravel, and who was now standing in her yard asking for nothing more than coffee and the chance to earn what came next. "Coffee on Sundays," Marit said, "but no advice unless I ask." Niels put his hat back on. "I would not know what to advise," he said. He brought coffee the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and every Sunday through the autumn, and into the winter, and through the second spring, and somewhere in that procession of Sundays, the coffee became supper, and the supper became conversation that lasted past dark, and the conversation became the kind of silence that two people share when they have stopped needing to fill it. They married in the spring of 1890. The ceremony was brief: a circuit preacher, 2 witnesses, a meal afterward at the cabin table. Niels did not ask Marit to leave her claim. He moved a small cabin onto her property, 50 yards south of the main house, and connected it with a short passage that Marit designed, and they dug together in 3 weeks. The passage between the cabins was only 30 feet long and 4 feet deep, but it was shored and crowned and sloped, and on winter mornings Niels could walk to Marit's kitchen without opening a door to the wind. He never called it her claim. He called it the place. Marit called it home, which was a word she had not used since Minnesota. The years compressed the way years do when the work is steady and the ground is known. 1891. A daughter, Christy, born in the cabin with a neighbor woman attending because the nearest midwife was Beret, and Beret was dead. Marit delivered the child with the competence of a woman who had calved a cow in a blizzard and did not see why a human birth should be more complicated. It was more complicated. She did not say so afterward. 1892. The barn complex reached its full form. The original passage, rebuilt with cedar where cottonwood had rotted, ran from kitchen to barn. The root cellar spur held potatoes, turnips, carrots, and jars of preserved tomatoes. The milk room stayed cool enough in July to keep butter firm. The storm line to the well curb had been extended to the chicken house. A new passage, short and shallow, connected the chicken house to the barn. The entire system could be walked underground in 8 minutes, and Marit walked it every morning before dawn, checking walls and floors and hatches and drains with the habitual attention of a woman who knew what water could do when it was not watched. 1894. A son, Halvor, named for Marit's father. He was born in January during a mild storm that did not test the passage, but reminded everyone that storms came whether you were ready or not. Niels held the boy in the kitchen while Marit descended through the trap door to feed the horses, and when she came back up, the boy was asleep against Niels's chest, and the cabin smelled of coffee and cedar and the mineral warmth that rose from the passage below. 1896. Tolliver retired from ranching and sold his remaining stock. He kept his house and 50 acres and a single horse, and he rode to Marit's claim once a month for no reason he was willing to name. He drank coffee at her table and talked about weather and grass and the price of beef, and sometimes he descended into the passage and walked its length alone, his hand on the wall, his hat brushing the ceiling. He never said what he was looking for down there. Marit never asked. 1900. Christy was 9 and Halvor was 6, and both of them had been told not to play in the old passage, and both of them played in it constantly. They chased each other through the dark on hands and knees, counting the uprights by feel, racing to see who could reach the barn hatch first. Marit heard their laughter through the cabin floor and did not stop them. The passage was their inheritance. It would teach them what it had taught her, that the earth holds what you give it, and the dark is not dangerous if you know the shape of the walls. 1903. Niels expanded the main barn and dug a new passage section to connect the addition. He did the work himself, using Marit's plans, and when he set the first upright, Marit descended to inspect it and found the pole plumb and the base packed with gravel, and the spacing set at 18 inches without being told. Tolliver would approve, she said. Tolliver approved 4 years ago, Niels said. He told me at the table when you were in the barn. Marit looked at the upright. What else did he tell you at the table? That I married above my competence. He was right. Niels laughed. It was a rare sound from him, and it echoed in the unfinished passage like something alive. The years continued, and the passages endured, and the valley changed around them the way valleys change. Slowly, by addition, one fence and one roof and one grave at a time. Tolliver died in 1908, in his chair, looking out his window at grass he no longer owned. Niels's boy from his first passage, the 12-year-old who had held a shovel during the spring flood repair, grew up and homesteaded his own claim 20 miles north and dug a passage of his own without asking anyone for help. The Espelon family added a second passage and a root cellar and became known for potatoes that lasted until April in a valley where most cellars froze solid by February. Marit did not call any of it an invention. When visitors asked us SARS and visitors came, drawn by the story that had traveled with the freighter's brown paper notes and the assessor's report and the quiet word of mouth that moves between farms like water through gravel, she showed them the passage and the probe and the plans and said the same thing every time. It is the way to the barn. Not a system, not a method, not a breakthrough. The way to the barn. As if the passage had always been there, waiting in the earth, and she had merely cleared the dirt away from it. Marit Brecke died in late autumn of 1917 of pneumonia that settled in her lungs during a cold October rain and did not leave. She was 57 years old. She died in the cabin, in the bed she and Niels had shared for 27 years, with the trapdoor still fitted square in the kitchen floor and the stove burning low, and the sound of horses in the barn coming faintly through the boards. Niels outlived her by 6 years. He kept the passages clear and the hatches latched and the rope lines taut. When he walked the tunnel in the mornings, he carried the iron probe she had hung on the nail by the stove, not to test the soil, which he knew by heart, but because the weight of it in his hand was the closest he could come to holding what she had left behind. By the second winter after the Great Storm, 6 families in the lower Powder River Valley had copied some part of what Marit built. Not always full passages, some were half-depth trenches, some were covered runs banked with sod, some were nothing more than storm hatches and knotted ropes strung between iron stakes. But all of them shared the same principle. The earth holds what you give it, and the distance between a house and a barn is not measured in yards, but in whether you can cross it when crossing matters. The innovation spread because it was not magic. It was labor, measurement, earth, timber, and respect for weather. Marit lived out her years on the Brecka claim, in the cabin with the canvas-patched west wall that Niels eventually finished with proper lumber, with the trapdoor in the kitchen floor the children were told not to open and opened anyway. She never called the passage an invention. She called it the way to the barn, and the name held because the name was true. In her later years, she kept Beret's Bible on the shelf above the stove, and the Norwegian note inside it, unread by anyone else, and the iron probe on the nail where two different hands had hung two different rods made for the same purpose. At Pike's store, which was no longer Pike's store but still carried the name the way a scar carries the memory of the blade, the cowboys had laughed at the widow's prairie dog hallway. They had slapped their knees and shaken their heads, and repeated the phrase until it became the valley's best joke. And then the storm came, and the wind erased the barn from 40 yards away, and the men who laughed listened to their cattle dying beyond doors they could not open. Marit Brecka walked under the snow with a lantern in one hand and a feed bucket in the other, and every animal she touched was alive in the morning. Years later, after she was gone, snow covered the yard so completely that cabin and barn seemed separated by a white, impossible distance. Inside, beneath the kitchen floor, the old boards of the trapdoor still fit tight, and below them, in the dark earth, the passage waited,